Tonight, we're talking about the guillotine. The guillotine most people picture immediately. A heavy wooden frame, a slanted blade, powdered wigs, angry crowds, and France going through an extremely intense historical phase. It has become shorthand for revolution, punishment, and public spectacle. More specifically, this is the story of the last person ever executed by guillotine. A detail that surprises many people is how late this actually happened. Not in medieval times, not during the French Revolution, not even in the early 20th century. This story reaches all the way into the late 1970s, when disco was popular, color television was normal, and microwaves were already part of everyday life. When people think of the guillotine, they usually imagine the height of the French Revolution, massive crowds, heads falling into baskets, and political figures like Robespierre shaping events with extreme certainty. That image is accurate but incomplete. The guillotine was introduced in the late 1700s as what was considered a humane method of execution. The idea was that if the state insisted on executing someone, it should do so quickly and without prolonged suffering. At the time, this was viewed as progress. What matters for this story is that the guillotine did not disappear after the revolution ended. It remained part of the French legal system. Over time, executions became less frequent and less public. They moved behind prison walls, away from crowds and spectacle, and became administrative procedures carried out by officials following protocol. By the 20th century, the guillotine was no longer a revolutionary symbol. It was simply state equipment, stored, maintained, transported when necessary, and used occasionally. While many European countries abolished capital punishment, France continued to keep it as a legal option, even as public support weakened and executions became rare. This brings the story to the man at its center, Hamida Djandoubi. He was not royalty, noble, or politically powerful. He was born in 1949 in Tunisia and later moved to France, like many immigrants at the time, in search of work and stability. He worked as a gardener and lived a modest life. In the early 1970s, Djandoubi suffered a workplace accident that resulted in the loss of part of his leg. After that, his life began to deteriorate gradually. He struggled with chronic pain, unemployment, alcohol abuse, and increasing anger. People around him noticed that he became more volatile and isolated, but these warning signs did not lead to intervention. In 1974, Djandoubi met a young woman named Elizabeth Bousquet, who was 21 years old. Their relationship was unstable and marked by jealousy, control, and violence. Later that same year, Elizabeth disappeared. Her body was eventually found, and Djandoubi was arrested. There was no serious doubt about his guilt. The evidence was overwhelming, and he confessed. He was tried, convicted, and in 1977 sentenced to death. At this point, the story shifts from a personal crime to a historical turning point. By the 1970s, executions in France were extremely rare. The guillotine had not been used in years, and many people believed it effectively belonged to the past. However, the law still allowed capital punishment, and after Djandoubi's appeals failed, the French government chose to proceed. There was no public announcement and no crowd. The decision moved quietly through the legal system. The guillotine was prepared. It had a traditional name, La Veuve, meaning the widow. On September 10, 1977, at 4:40 a.m., Hamida Djandoubi was executed by guillotine at Beaumet's prison in Marseille. No photographs circulated widely, no dramatic public reaction followed. Only a small group of officials witnessed the event. With that execution, the guillotine's long history effectively ended. 4 years later, in 1981, France abolished capital punishment entirely. The machine was never used again. It was not ceremonially destroyed or publicly retired. It was simply removed from use and stored away, becoming an artifact of a past the country no longer wished to continue. This execution did not take place in a distant, primitive era. It happened in the modern age, during a time many people still remember. That contrast is what makes the story linger. Last time, we ended with the guillotine doing its final, deeply unnecessary task in 1977. One last swing, one last official report, and then silence. But of course, history never actually ends things cleanly. It just leaves objects behind and pretends that's closure. So now we need to talk about what happened after the last execution, because France didn't abolish the death penalty immediately. They just sat with it, like someone who's broken up but still hasn't returned to the hoodie. In the late 1970s, France was in an uncomfortable position. On paper, it was a modern democracy, a member of the European community, a cultural capital of art, philosophy, and wine opinions, but it was also one of the last Western European countries still executing people, and not by lethal injection or some quiet medicalized process, but by guillotine, which is not subtle and does not blend in with modern aesthetics. Other countries had already abolished capital punishment or were in the process of doing so, while France was arguing about whether it should keep a machine that looked like it belonged in a museum but still worked. Public opinion was split, with many people uncomfortable with executions, yet deeply afraid of crime, holding on to the belief that harsh punishment meant safety, that if the state showed strength, everything else would magically calm down. It never does, but humans love believing it might. Politicians reflected this indecision perfectly. No one wanted to be accused of being soft. No one wanted to explain to angry voters why murderers deserved mercy, especially in the 1970s when fear sold very well. And so the guillotine remained legal, untouched, waiting. The key figure in this next phase was Robert Badinter, important in a quiet, lawyerly way, a criminal defense attorney who had spent years representing people facing execution, who hated the death penalty, not loudly or theatrically, but steadily and rationally, having watched clients die, appeals fail, and the state kill people and then move on as if clearing a desk, until he finally decided he'd had enough. In 1981, France elected François Mitterrand, a socialist reformer who opposed capital punishment and who, as president, had the power to grant clemency. He made it clear early on that no one would be executed under his presidency, effectively freezing the guillotine, still legal, still technically available, but politically finished. Badinter was appointed Minister of Justice and introduced a bill to abolish the death penalty entirely, speaking before the National Assembly in a calm, measured, almost boring tone that was honestly perfect as he talked about the irreversible nature of execution, judicial error, the moral cost of the state killing its own citizens, and how the guillotine had no place in a modern society that claimed to value human rights. The backlash was exhausting. Accusations of defending criminals, warnings that abolition would encourage crime, newspapers dripping with fear, victims' families constantly invoked, often without consent. But eventually, in September 1981, France voted to abolish the death penalty, just like that, after nearly 2 centuries of use, thousands of executions, and one very awkward final act in the 1970s. The guillotine was officially retired, and the strange part was that no one really knew what to do with it. The machines were dismantled, some pieces ending up in museums, some in storage, some quietly disappearing into archives visited only by people writing very specific dissertations. There was no national ceremony, no apology tour, no big reckoning. France simply moved on, which is very on brand. Today, the guillotine exists mostly as an image, a symbol, a punchline printed on T-shirts or used in political cartoons, but it was a real machine used by real people on real bodies for a very long time, and its final victim was not a king, not a revolutionary, not a textbook villain, just a man whose life went wrong in all the most ordinary ways, which is often how history actually works. As we gently drift forward, it's worth noting that France didn't just abolish the death penalty, it became one of its strongest opponents, pushing for abolition across Europe, signing international treaties, and making opposition part of its modern identity. The same country that once perfected mechanized execution now lectures others about human rights, because history loves irony and feeds on it. And if you think this story ends quietly with laws, signatures, and relief, not quite, because while the guillotine stopped falling, debates about punishment, justice, and violence never really go away. They just change language, change methods, change headlines. And in the next part, we gently widen the lens to other countries, their last executions, and how uncomfortable that process often was. There were no dramatic endings, no unified moral conclusions, only gradual retreats, quiet pauses, and legal compromises that allowed nations to move on without fully confronting what they had been doing. France was late to abolish the death penalty, but it was not alone in being late. It was simply more visible about it. Other countries stopped more quietly, changed methods, or ended executions in practice while leaving the laws intact, like relics preserved for reassurance rather than use. In Western Europe, abolition became a social expectation after World War II. The war had left the continent deeply uneasy with state-sponsored killing, an understandable reaction after years of systematic violence carried out in the name of law and order. Executions began to feel incompatible with the idea of a modern state. Britain abolished the death penalty for murder in 1965, but the process was far from smooth. There were temporary suspensions, endless parliamentary debates, and newspaper predictions of crime waves that never truly appeared. Britain's last executions took place in 1964. Two men, Peter Allen and Gwyn Evans, were hanged on the same day in different prisons. The process was efficient and quiet, with no ceremony and no public gathering. The country moved on and almost immediately acted as though it had always intended to. Germany abolished the death penalty in 1949, a decision shaped by extremely obvious historical circumstances. After a recent past defined by industrial-scale murder, execution was removed entirely from the legal system. Italy followed. Spain took longer. Portugal had abolished the death penalty much earlier, in the 19th century, occasionally finding itself far ahead of broader European consensus and receiving little acknowledgement for it. By the late 20th century, Europe had largely agreed that executions no longer belonged in modern governance. Against that backdrop, France's 1977 guillotine execution felt deeply out of place, like an artifact from another era appearing where it no longer made sense. Across the Atlantic, the story unfolded differently. The United States developed a complicated and unresolved relationship with the death penalty. In the early 1970s, executions were paused after the Supreme Court ruled that existing laws were applied unfairly. For a brief period, abolition seemed possible. That moment passed, laws were rewritten, methods were adjusted, and executions resumed. The practice did not end, it was rebranded. Electric chairs gave way to lethal injections, gas chambers faded into obscurity, and executions were reframed as clinical procedures. The intention was not to eliminate violence, but to minimize discomfort for witnesses, officials, and the public. The last execution by firing squad in the United States occurred in 2010. The last use of the electric chair was in 2008. These methods were not abandoned because they failed to work, but because they were visually and emotionally unsettling. Optics once again determined policy. France was not the only country to use the guillotine. Germany employed it extensively under the Nazi regime, as did Austria into the 1930s and 1940s. It was efficient, portable, and symbolically terrifying. After the war, it became unacceptable to acknowledge its existence. Ownership of such machines became something no state wished to explain, and so they were quietly removed from public life. What remains striking is how societies remember these tools. The guillotine survives as a shocking relic, almost exaggerated by time. Modern execution methods, by contrast, are described in administrative language: protocols, dosages, appeals. One feels medieval, the other feels bureaucratic. The outcome remains unchanged. This is where the story returns to Hamida Jandoubi. His execution was not widely perceived as shocking when it occurred. It passed with little international reaction, no emergency summits, no sustained outrage. It was reported briefly and then forgotten. History did not react loudly when the last guillotine fell. It barely acknowledged the moment at all. That quietness reflects how endings often occur. They arrive without ceremony, without clarity, and without a shared sense of closure. The guillotine lingers in the imagination because it is visible, mechanical, and unapologetic. It does not attempt to appear gentle or clinical. It does not disguise itself as a medical procedure. It presents the act honestly, without symbolic comfort. Perhaps that is why its final use feels more unsettling than the thousands of executions that followed using modern methods. The guillotine forces recognition of what is happening and what it means. Once France accepted that reality, continuation became impossible. The blade stopped, the laws changed, the machine became history. Not through dramatic reckoning or moral awakening, but through a quiet vote and a collective sense of relief. By the time the guillotine was officially retired, it had already become something strange. Not just a machine, not just a method, but a kind of historical ghost. Because the guillotine didn't disappear when the law changed, it just lost its job. And like many things that outlive their purpose, it lingered in storage rooms, museums, footnotes, and the collective imagination. Some of the actual blades still exist, real ones, heavy, sharp, and maintained far better than you'd expect for something designed for death. They sit behind glass now, labeled politely, as if they were always meant to be educational. Visitors walk past them slowly, read the plaques, nod, take photos, and sometimes feel uncomfortable without quite knowing why. Because when you look at a guillotine, there's no illusion, no abstraction, no medical language to soften it. It is exactly what it is, and that's probably why it survived so well in memory. After abolition, France made a deliberate effort to reframe its relationship with capital punishment. Schools taught abolition as progress. Politicians spoke of it as inevitable, something modern societies simply outgrow. And yet the guillotine remained one of the most recognizable symbols of French history. Not wine, not fashion, not philosophy, but a blade. It showed up in movies, cartoons, political metaphors, and lazy jokes about revolutions, cheese, and beheadings. And every time it carried the same strange contradiction, something horrifying treated lightly because distance makes everything easier. What rarely comes up in these retellings is the sheer longevity of the machine. The guillotine outlasted kings, outlasted empires, outlasted revolutions, and outlasted world wars. It began as a symbol of equality. Everyone dies the same way, rich or poor, noble or peasant. A very Enlightenment idea if you squint, and it ended as a bureaucratic embarrassment. The last execution didn't come with ideology, speeches, or moral crusades, just a court case, a rejected appeal, and a machine that still technically worked, which makes it oddly fitting because the guillotine was never really about rage, not in practice. That was the crowd's part. The machine itself was about efficiency, predictability, and control. It was violence domesticated by procedure. And that's the part modern societies still struggle with. Not whether violence exists, but how neatly it's packaged. When France abolished the death penalty, it didn't suddenly become a non-violent place. Crimes still happened, murders still occurred, and tragedy didn't pause out of respect for the law. What changed was the state's role in finality. No more irreversible decisions made in the name of certainty, at least not in that particular form. And Hamida Jandoubi became a historical marker, not because of who he was, but because of when he existed. If he had committed the same crime 4 years later, he would not have been executed. 4 years earlier, and no one would remember his name at all. History is rarely fair like that. It chooses its symbols at random and then pretends it was intentional. Today, when people learn that the last guillotine execution happened in 1977, there's usually a pause, a mental recalibration, a quiet, wait, really? Because the 1970s don't feel that far away. They feel recorded, familiar, modern enough to feel safe, and yet behind prison walls, something ancient happened. That's the unsettling part. Not the blade, not the blood, but the realization that progress doesn't move in straight lines. It drags things with it. Old habits, old tools, old permissions, and sometimes it takes far longer than anyone expects to finally let them go. France eventually did, completely and firmly, without exception. The death penalty is now constitutionally banned, and the guillotine will never be used again. But the story doesn't end with abolition. It ends with memory, with how societies choose to remember what they once considered normal. The guillotine has become safe now, safe to talk about, safe to joke about, safe to put on postcards, because it no longer threatens anyone. And that, perhaps, is its final transformation. From instrument of fear to historical curiosity, from active threat to passive warning, a reminder of how easily brutality can be justified when it's organized, legalized, and framed as necessary, and how quietly it can persist long after the world thinks it's moved on. That's the full arc, not dramatic, not triumphant, just slow, human, and a little uncomfortable. 2,000 years ago, in ancient Rome, a civilization that gave us aqueducts, concrete, and roads that still work better than some modern ones, there was also the confident decision to not invent toilet paper, which is really what we're here for tonight. Because if you've ever wondered what ancient Romans used instead of toilet paper, the answer is strange, communal, slightly alarming, and extremely on brand for Rome. So we begin gently with the Roman bathroom, which was nothing like what you're imagining. No privacy, no candles, no shelves, just long stone rooms with marble benches lining the walls, evenly spaced holes, no dividers, no stalls, no awkward gaps, just holes side by side. Because this was not a private experience, but a social one, where you didn't sneak off to freshen up, but sat next to strangers, co-workers, political rivals, or your boss, sometimes all at once. And yes, conversations happened. Business deals, gossip, probably philosophy, because why not debate stoicism while doing something profoundly unstoic? And underneath the bench ran channels of water carrying waste away through Rome's impressive sewer system, like the Cloaca Maxima, which honestly still holds up. But the real issue wasn't where things went, it was how things ended. Because when you were done, there was no paper, no leaves, no corn cobs, no soft-scented three-ply luxury. Instead, the Romans used something called a tersorium, which was a sea sponge on a stick. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. And here's where modern listeners tense up slightly. The sponge was shared, not within families, but fully shared, left in a bucket of salt water near the latrine. You finished, you rinsed it, you put it back, you left, and someone else came along. And this was normal. accepted, daily life, with no angry letters or demands for reform, as Pliny the Elder mentions sponges casually, Seneca references latrines without concern, Martial jokes about bathroom habits, and no one seems horrified, because germ theory didn't exist, and disease was blamed on bad air, angry gods, or fate having a bad day. So if you got sick, it wasn't the sponge, the universe was just in a mood. And although some historians debate whether the tersorium was for wiping or cleaning, that debate mostly exists because modern scholars desperately want it to be less personal than it appears. But archaeological placement and Roman writing strongly suggest, yes, the sponge on a stick was doing the job. And while that sounds horrifying, sea sponges are absorbent and soft-ish. Romans bathed frequently, public baths were daily habits, and personal cleanliness mattered, just not in the way we expect, meaning they didn't smell like monsters, they just had different priorities, like efficiency, engineering, and communal everything, because privacy was not a Roman obsession. Reputation, honor, and status were, but solitude wasn't. Even emperors were rarely alone, so sitting shoulder to shoulder using a sponge that had seen things was just part of being Roman. And while wealthier Romans sometimes had private toilets tucked into kitchens or corridors for plumbing access, toilet paper still wasn't a thing there either, with cloths, wool, or extra sponges washed and reused, which sounds alarming until you remember almost nothing was disposable. And as for what Romans didn't use, paper didn't exist as we know it. Papyrus was too valuable. Parchment was animal skin and far too weird even for Rome. While leaves, smooth stones, broken pottery shards called pessoi, and bits of wood were sometimes used, especially in rural areas. Unpleasant but accepted, because comfort was relative, and the ancient world was full of minor daily discomforts people simply lived with. And socially, latrines were meeting places built near forums, baths, and markets, with graffiti scratched into walls, jokes, insults, love notes, deeply immature comments, reminding us humanity has always been humanity. So while the sponge situation was unsanitary by modern standards, the latrine was a social hub, human and oddly calming. No phones, no scrolling, just people, stone benches, running water, and the shared understanding that everyone there was doing the same thing, equalized by biology, even emperors, who, despite private facilities, still lived in the world where sponges on sticks were the norm. No golden paper or perfumed wipes, just Rome doing Rome things. And if this makes you mildly uncomfortable, that's part of the charm, because history isn't just marble statues and epic speeches, it's daily life, logistics, hygiene, and how people solved problems before modern convenience. And from here, we drift onward into Roman cleanliness, bathing habits, oils instead of soap, strigils scraping dirt from skin, and how a civilization obsessed with public baths accepted a shared wiping sponge without blinking, because ancient Rome was advanced, brutal, ingenious, and occasionally deeply questionable. So take a slow breath, get comfortable again, and when you're ready, we'll continue gently onward. If you shifted slightly during the sponge discussion, that's understandable. But don't worry. Tonight, we're gliding gently forward into something the Romans were much more proud of, something they talked about constantly and built enormous buildings for: baths. Because if there was one area where ancient Rome truly believed it had civilization figured out, it was bathing, public bathing, mandatory bathing, extremely social bathing. And yes, this connects directly to the bathroom situation, whether they liked it or not. Roman baths were everywhere. Big cities had massive complexes, small towns had modest ones, and even military forts had baths, because apparently nothing says discipline like naked soldiers chatting about their day. Bathing wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about routine, status, health, community, politics, networking, romance, and occasionally mild existential dread. A typical Roman bath complex was enormous, with hot rooms, warm rooms, cold plunges, exercise courtyards, libraries, gardens, food stalls, and places to sit around doing absolutely nothing. You didn't rush through this. This was an event. People spent hours there every day. And here's the thing, they didn't use soap, at least not soap like we know it. Instead, Romans used oil, mostly olive oil. They rubbed it all over their bodies, collecting sweat, dust, and general daily grime, then scraped it off using a curved metal tool called a strigil. Imagine being gently peeled like a vegetable. That mixture of oil, dirt, and skin was called gloius, and yes, it was gross, but also weirdly valuable. Some people believed it had medicinal properties, and gladiator sweat was especially prized, because of course it was. There is always a market for the bodily fluids of famous people, and Rome was no exception. After scraping, you might rinse off in water. Hot, warm, cold, repeat, then more oil and more scraping. Cleanliness achieved, sort of. This system worked because Romans bathed frequently, daily if possible, so even without soap, people weren't walking around coated in centuries of grime. This ties back to the latrine issue, because while the sponge on a stick situation sounds horrifying to us, Romans would often bathe shortly after using the toilet. Especially in cities, latrines were built near baths on purpose. You do the unpleasant thing, then you go soak, scrape, and reset your dignity. Efficiency. Of course, this system still had flaws, many flaws. Bathwater wasn't always changed frequently. Warm pools were perfect breeding grounds for bacteria. Strigils could nick skin. Oils could trap dirt if used incorrectly, and parasites were common. But expectations were different. The Roman goal wasn't sterility, it was routine. And that routine included being very comfortable with other people's bodies. Public baths were fully communal. Men and women sometimes bathed separately, and sometimes together, depending on the era and location. Children were there, elderly people were there, slaves were there, senators were there. Everyone naked, everyone sweaty, everyone pretending this was totally normal. And it was. Roman hygiene habits make more sense when you understand Roman attitudes toward the body. Romans were practical. They admired strength, discipline, and control. They didn't romanticize nature the way later cultures did. The body was a tool that needed maintenance. You fed it, trained it, cleaned it, not delicately, not privately, just efficiently. This mindset extended to bathroom habits as well. The latrine was not a shameful place, but a functional one, with no moral weight attached to bodily functions and no embarrassment or dramatic secrecy. If anything, Romans thought excessive modesty was suspicious, so when people chatted casually while using the toilet, it wasn't because they lacked social awareness, but because their idea of what was awkward was different. Silence was awkward. Being alone was awkward. Togetherness was reassuring. Before romanticizing this too much, it's worth acknowledging that Roman sanitation had serious problems. Parasites were widespread, intestinal worms were common, lead pipes contaminated water in some areas, sewers backed up, rats existed, and yes, the sponge. Shared sponges likely spread disease, something we know now, but they did not. The fact that people survived anyway says more about human resilience than Roman wisdom. If someone got sick, it wasn't blamed on hygiene, but on fate, the gods, bad luck, or an imbalance of bodily humors. Medicine was creative, bloodletting, diet changes, baths, rest, or occasionally doing absolutely nothing and hoping for the best. Not everyone in the Roman world lived the same way. Rural Romans, soldiers on campaign, and the poor often didn't have access to grand latrines or baths and used whatever was available: leaves, moss, water, cloth scraps. In some areas, smooth stones were common and could be rinsed and reused. Broken pottery shards show up archaeologically with wear patterns that strongly suggest repeated use, and we'll leave it at that. While this sounds miserable, it's worth remembering that many modern conveniences didn't exist for most people until the 19th century, and toilet paper itself wasn't widespread until the 19th century. Rome wasn't uniquely strange, just early. Roman hygiene also intersected with class. Wealthy Romans prided themselves on cleanliness, bathed often, used expensive oils, and had private facilities, but they lived in a world where servants handled bodily messes. Slaves cleaned latrines, maintained sewers, and washed sponges. The comfort of elite Romans was built on invisible labor, on people who dealt with the worst parts of sanitation so others didn't have to think about it. History rarely changes that part. When a senator sat comfortably in a latrine chatting with friends, he wasn't the one emptying buckets or scrubbing stone benches. Someone else did that, quietly, daily, and that labor kept Rome running. Despite all this, Roman cities didn't collapse under disease immediately. They functioned for centuries. People adapted, bodies adjusted, and immunity developed. It wasn't perfect, but it was sustainable enough. There's something strangely calming about realizing that humans have always found ways to live with imperfect systems, even when those systems involved shared sponges. As we float forward, we'll begin to look at how Roman hygiene compared to other ancient cultures, the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the medieval world that followed, which somehow managed to be worse in some ways. History isn't a straight line toward comfort. It zigzags, and sometimes it takes a long detour through questionable bathroom decisions. So breathe slowly, let your mind wander, and when you're ready, we'll continue drifting onward. By now, the sponge has probably stopped feeling shocking and started feeling oddly familiar. That's usually how this goes. History has a way of lowering your standards very gently. So in this part, we're going to do something comforting. We're going to give Rome a break. Because as strange as Roman bathroom habits were, they were not alone. In fact, compared to some of their neighbors and successors, Rome was almost organized. So let's drift outward and sideways through time and see what other ancient cultures were doing with the exact same problem. Because everyone poops. Civilization is mostly about how you handle that fact. Let's start with the Greeks, since Rome borrowed so much from them anyway. Ancient Greek toilets existed, but they were less standardized. Some cities had public latrines, but many people relied on chamber pots or simple pits. And when it came time to clean up, Greeks often used pessoi. Pessoi was small, smooth stones, sometimes ceramic, sometimes just rocks. They were shaped to be held comfortably, reusable, rinse and repeat. Yes, literally. There's something oddly minimalist about it. No sponge, no stick, just a stone, some water, and a lot of trust in your aim. And if you're wondering whether this was pleasant, no, it was not. But again, this was normal. People adapted. There's even a darkly humorous theory that the Greek practice of ostracism, where a citizen's name was scratched onto pottery shards, may have had a symbolic insult component. As in, you're not just voting someone out of the city, you're associating them with trash, possibly bathroom trash. Historians argue about this, but the vibe checks out. Now, the Greeks also bathed, though less obsessively than Romans. They used oils and scrapers too, and they were equally casual about bodily functions. Philosophers discussed life's deepest questions while walking, bathing, or relieving themselves. Socrates almost certainly annoyed someone in a public space while doing something deeply human. So again, Rome wasn't inventing weirdness, it was inheriting it. Now let's slide over to ancient Egypt, because Egypt is always doing its own thing. Egyptians actually had a somewhat more private approach. Wealthier homes had dedicated toilet rooms with limestone seats. Underneath was a container filled with sand. After use, sand absorbed waste and could be disposed of. For cleaning, Egyptians likely used water, cloth, or natural materials like reeds. They were meticulous about cleanliness in many areas of life. Ritual purity mattered. They also shaved body hair regularly, bathed often, and used perfumes. So in some ways, Egyptian hygiene feels oddly modern. But again, access mattered. Poorer Egyptians had fewer options, simpler solutions, and disposal was still a major challenge. No ancient society fully solved sanitation. They just made trade-offs. Now let's take a slow, calming leap forward in time, because this is where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean quietly disappointing. The fall of the Western Roman Empire didn't just affect politics, it affected plumbing. Aqueducts fell into disrepair, sewers stopped being maintained, public baths closed. Cities shrank, infrastructure collapsed, and with it, many hygiene habits vanished. Medieval Europe, especially in its early centuries, did not inherit Rome's bathroom culture. Instead, it went backwards. People used chamber pots, they dumped waste into streets, they used rags, straw, leaves, or nothing. Privacy increased, cleanliness decreased. Bathing became suspicious. Some believed frequent bathing weakened the body or opened pores to disease, which is not how that works, but nobody knew that yet. Public latrines existed, but they were less advanced. Waste flowed into rivers. Streets smelled terrible. Disease spread easily. And here's the ironic part. Medieval Europeans would have been horrified by the idea of a shared sponge. They valued modesty and separation, but their alternatives were often worse, less communal, more filthy. So Rome, for all its questionable choices, at least invested in infrastructure. Now let's gently come back to the Romans themselves, because their world wasn't static. Hygiene practices changed over time. As Christianity spread, attitudes toward the body shifted. Modesty increased, public bathing declined. Toilets became more private, shared spaces became morally complicated, and gradually the Roman way of handling bodily functions faded. The sponge disappeared, the latrine emptied, and Europe entered a long period of improvisation. Now let's pause here for a moment, because there's something oddly soothing about this entire topic. It reminds us that discomfort is relative. What feels unacceptable to us would have felt ordinary to someone else, and what feels normal to us would probably feel deeply strange to them. Ancient Romans would be baffled by our obsession with privacy. We would be baffled by their indifference to it. Neither side is right or wrong, just adapted to different worlds. And this is where we can gently zoom in on daily life again. Imagine being a Roman citizen. You wake up early, you eat bread, maybe some cheese, you go about your work. At some point, you visit the latrine. You sit next to someone you know. You chat, you use the sponge, you rinse it, you move on. This doesn't feel dramatic, it doesn't feel gross, it just feels like Tuesday. History becomes less shocking when you stop imagining it through modern reactions and start imagining it through routine. So, as we drift onward, we're going to look at how long it took for something resembling modern toilet paper to appear and why it took so long, and how, even when it did appear, people were skeptical. Because humans are very good at getting used to whatever system they're born into, even if that system involves a sponge that absolutely should not be shared. So, now we arrive at the quiet ending of this story. Not a dramatic ending, not a revolutionary moment where someone bursts into a room waving a roll of soft paper and shouting that everything has changed, because history almost never works like that. Instead, this is the kind of ending where things slowly improve, unevenly, awkwardly, and with a lot of resistance along the way. After Rome faded, and after Europe spent centuries improvising its way through sanitation, the idea of something specifically designed for wiping took a very long time to become normal. And it didn't start in Europe, it started in China. By the 6th century, Chinese records already mentioned the use of paper for hygiene, not luxury paper or calligraphy quality paper, but rough, cheap paper made for a very specific purpose. And even then it wasn't universal, just an option for those who had access to it. By the 14th century, during the Ming Dynasty, China was producing toilet paper at scale, with records describing sheets made specifically for the imperial court, soft, large, plentiful, and the emperor, it seems, did not use a sponge. The idea took a very long time to spread elsewhere, because paper was expensive in most of the world, and even when it became more common, people struggled to rethink its purpose. Paper was for writing, for books, for records, and using it for the bathroom felt wasteful, almost offensive. In Europe, people continued using rags, straw, moss, wool, hay, water, hands, or whatever happened to be nearby, with old newspapers, catalog pages, and scraps becoming popular because they had already served their real purpose, and the idea of manufacturing paper just to throw it away after one use felt absurd, which honestly makes sense. When modern toilet paper finally appeared in the 19th century, it wasn't immediately embraced, and early products were marketed cautiously and delicately, with euphemisms promising cleanliness, comfort, and relief from irritation without ever being too specific, because even then people were embarrassed. That's the quiet irony. The Romans weren't embarrassed at all, but they shared a sponge, while modern people demanded privacy, delicacy, and softness and still took centuries to solve the problem cleanly. Progress is strange like that. When we gently reflect on Rome one last time, it's easy to laugh at the sponge, and yes, a little laughter is deserved. But Roman sanitation was part of a broader system. Aqueducts delivered fresh water, sewers carried waste away, public baths promoted regular cleaning. And while the sponge wasn't ideal, it existed within an infrastructure that was remarkably advanced for its time. When that infrastructure collapsed, hygiene didn't improve, it worsened, reminding us that history isn't a straight line from bad to good, but more like a loop, where people solve one problem, forget how they solved it, and then reinvent a solution centuries later while daily life continues. People wake up, they eat, they work, they deal with basic human needs, and most of history happens at that level, not in battles or speeches, but in routines. The Roman latrine was one of those routines, ordinary, frequent, unremarkable to the people who used it, and the sponge on a stick wasn't a symbol of backwardness, but a tool, a compromise, a solution that made sense within a specific world, and when that world disappeared, so did the solution. What replaced it wasn't immediately better, just different. So when we think about ancient Rome, it's tempting to imagine marble statues, grand architecture, and dramatic politics. But Rome was also stone benches, running water, buckets of salt water, and a shared understanding that this was just how things were done. And in that way, it wasn't so different from us. We trust systems without thinking too hard about them. We accept routines because questioning them would be exhausting. And someone in the future will probably look back at our habits with the same quiet disbelief, and they'll be right to do so. So that's the story. Not a heroic one, not a tragic one, just a deeply human one. A story about how one of the most powerful civilizations in history handled one of the most basic needs imaginable, with engineering, with confidence, and with a sponge that absolutely should not have been shared. And that's where we leave ancient Rome. Not in the Senate or on the battlefield, but sitting calmly on a stone bench, chatting with a neighbor, completely unbothered, convinced that this system worked just fine. We're talking about the most inbred royal dynasties in history. And yes, we are going beyond the Habsburgs, because while the Habsburgs are the poster children for royal family trees collapsing in on themselves like a lawn chair, they were very much not alone. This is not a horror story. This is not a scandal expose. This is more like a slow, meandering walk through generations of extremely powerful people who all agreed, again and again, that marrying their cousin was totally fine, actually, and probably a good idea. So let's settle in. Let's lower our expectations, and let's begin, gently, with the basic problem that ruined royal genetics for about 1,000 years: power. Because once upon a time, if you were a king or queen, your main job wasn't ruling wisely or inspiring your people. Your main job was not letting your stuff end up in someone else's hands. Land, titles, castles, tax rights, and very fancy chairs were all considered family property, and the easiest way to keep property in the family was to keep marrying the family. Not emotionally, not romantically, but logistically. So if you're wondering why medieval Europe looked at a perfectly good foreign princess and said, "No thanks, we'll take my sister's daughter instead," the answer is always the same: inheritance paperwork. Let's drift back to the early Middle Ages, where this habit really started to harden into tradition. Royal families didn't see themselves as part of a nation, they saw themselves as mobile corporations with bloodlines. Marriages weren't love stories, they were mergers, and mergers worked best when you already knew everyone at the table. Now, the church technically frowned on close kin marriages. Officially, cousins were discouraged, but enforcement was flexible, very flexible, especially when kings were involved. If a royal marriage broke church rules, there were options. You could get a special dispensation, you could quietly ignore the rule, or you could just marry first and ask forgiveness later. And once one generation did it and survived, the next generation thought, well, seems fine. Let's start softly with the Capetian dynasty of France, because they don't get enough credit for laying the groundwork of quiet, polite genetic chaos. The Capetians ruled France for centuries, and on paper they were extremely successful. Lots of kings, long reigns, fancy coronations, great hats. But behind the scenes, their marriage pool was narrow, very narrow. Capetian kings repeatedly married cousins, second cousins, and other relatives from nearby noble houses that were, surprise, also related to them. And over time, this created a ruling class that was less diverse European aristocracy and more extended family reunion with swords. The effects weren't immediately dramatic, which is the most dangerous kind of inbreeding, because when nothing obviously goes wrong, everyone assumes it's safe to continue. But over generations, we start to see patterns. Kings with chronic illnesses, queens with fertility problems, children who died young for reasons that were always described as God's will, which medieval people used the same way we use technical difficulties. One of the quieter tragedies of the Capetians was how often children just didn't make it. Infant mortality was high for everyone, sure, but royal children were supposed to have the best food, the best care, and the least exposure to danger, and yet they kept fading out early. No dramatic scandals, no wild deformities, just a long, sleepy pattern of "this one didn't survive either." Eventually, the main Capetian line ran out, which is itself a pretty gentle way for a dynasty to say, "we may have overdone it." From France, let's slowly drift eastward into one of the most impressively tangled family webs in history, the House of Valois and their extended relatives. The Valois inherited France after the Capetians, and they continued many of the same habits but with extra enthusiasm, marrying into the same noble families repeatedly, recycling bloodlines like they were trying to minimize waste. And this is where we start seeing more visible consequences. Take Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad, which is never a great nickname to inherit. Charles suffered from severe mental illness, periods of lucidity followed by complete psychological collapse. He believed he was made of glass, he attacked his own knights, he forgot who he was. Medieval people didn't have the language we do today for mental health. Everything was framed as possession, punishment, or divine mystery. But modern historians have pointed out something quietly important. Charles's family tree loops back on itself a lot. His parents were closely related, so were his grandparents, and his wife was also part of the same aristocratic ecosystem. Was inbreeding the sole cause of his illness? Probably not. But did it help? Absolutely not. And Charles's condition didn't just affect him, it destabilized France, contributed to internal chaos, and helped set the stage for centuries of conflict, which is a lot of damage for what started as "we'd prefer to keep this duchy in the family." Let's gently slide over to England, where royal inbreeding wore a slightly different outfit, but followed the same logic. The Plantagenets were not as tightly interwoven as some continental dynasties, but they still had a strong preference for familial bloodlines. Cousins married cousins, second cousins married even closer cousins. The English monarchy loved marrying into French royalty, which, as we've just discussed, was already very interrelated, so English kings kept importing the same genetic material from across the Channel and acting surprised when things got weird. Take Henry VI of England. Quiet, passive, deeply unwell.
Henry suffered from long catatonic episodes. He was incapable of ruling. He didn't recognize his own son at one point, and his reign collapsed into the Wars of the Roses, which is what happens when your king emotionally checks out and everyone else brings swords to the meeting. Again, mental illness isn't caused by one factor alone, but again, his ancestry shows repeated close family connections on both sides. And again, nobody stopped to say, hey, maybe we should marry someone new, because tradition is a powerful sedative. Now let's float south for a moment into the Iberian Peninsula, where things begin to quietly spiral. Before the Habsburgs arrived in full force, Spain and Portugal already had dense networks of intermarriage among their royal houses. The Trastamara dynasty in particular loved marrying cousins to secure alliances between Castile, Aragon, and Portugal. And on paper it worked. Spain unified, power consolidated.
Everyone clapped politely, but the genetic cost started adding up. We see rising rates of infertility, stillbirths, chronic illness, queens who went through pregnancy after pregnancy with no surviving heirs, kings who desperately needed sons and got silence instead, which in medieval terms was terrifying because no heir meant civil war, and civil war was worse than marrying your cousin. So they doubled down. And by the time the Habsburgs officially took over Spain, they weren't introducing inbreeding. They were inheriting a system that had already been quietly weakening itself for generations. But that's a story we'll sink into much later. Tonight, we're still in the warm-up phase. Let's pause gently on one more overlooked dynasty, the Ptolemies of Egypt. Yes, ancient. Yes, not medieval Europe, but absolutely required viewing. The Ptolemies didn't just marry cousins, they married siblings, full siblings, on purpose, repeatedly, because they were copying the Egyptian pharaohs who believed royal blood was divine and shouldn't mix with ordinary humans. The result was a dynasty where nearly everyone had the same ancestors on both sides of their family tree. Cleopatra VII, the famous one, was the product of centuries of brother-sister marriages. And while she was intelligent and politically brilliant, her family history is filled with instability, paranoia, assassinations, and rulers who behaved like they were one bad afternoon away from total collapse, which tracks. The Ptolemies are an extreme example, but they highlight the core belief that haunted royal families everywhere. Blood mattered more than health, and once that belief takes root, it's very hard to undo. So, as we drift toward the next part of this story, keep this thought gently in mind. Inbreeding wasn't stupidity, it was policy, a slow, deliberate choice made over and over again by people who believed the risk was worth it. And in the next part, we'll start meeting dynasties where the consequences become harder to ignore, where physical traits repeat, where illnesses stack, and where royal portraits begin to quietly scream, something is wrong here. But for now, let's rest right here. We talked about how royal inbreeding didn't start with deformities or disasters. It started quietly, sensibly, with contracts and castles and the deeply held belief that strangers could not be trusted with land. But now we reach the point where things begin to show, not explosively, not dramatically, just enough that court painters start making some very creative choices. We drift into Central Europe, where noble families were so interconnected that a wedding could also function as a family reunion, a business meeting, and a future inheritance dispute all at once. The House of Wittelsbach, rulers of Bavaria and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, may not be as famous as the Habsburgs, which might actually be a blessing, but they were deeply committed to marrying within a very small circle of relatives. Over centuries, Wittelsbach marriages circled back to the same families. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces,
and each generation politely pretended this was completely normal behavior for people chosen by God to rule. One of the most famous Wittelsbachs was King Ludwig II of Bavaria, known for his fairy tale castles like Neuschwanstein and his obsession with medieval fantasy. Ludwig was deeply eccentric, isolated, and emotionally unstable. He withdrew from public life, avoided human contact, and spent enormous sums building imaginary medieval worlds while ignoring reality. Eventually, he was declared insane and removed from power, dying shortly afterward under mysterious circumstances in a lake, an ending that feels strangely appropriate for a family whose decision-making had been questionable for generations. Inbreeding was not the only cause, but when mental illness appears repeatedly in a tightly closed gene pool, historians tend to quietly clear their throats and point at the family tree. Moving north into Scandinavia, royal inbreeding was less intense, but still very present, especially as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden swapped royal spouses to maintain alliances. The House of Oldenburg, which ruled Denmark and supplied kings to several European thrones, frequently married cousins. While many Oldenburg rulers were capable, their family history shows recurring patterns of depression, alcoholism, and erratic behavior. King Christian VII of Denmark suffered from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia. He self-harmed, was incapable of ruling, and his court quietly took over governance while pretending he remained in control. His parents were first cousins, and once again, nobody questioned the marriage until the king began unraveling in public. From there, we move to one of the most emotionally exhausting royal families of all time, the Romanovs of Russia. Early on, they avoided extreme inbreeding, but over time, they increasingly married into the same German princely houses, families already related to them. By the 19th century, Romanov blood was heavily recycled through a small cluster of dynasties. This is where one of the most tragic consequences of royal inbreeding appears: hemophilia. The disorder entered European royalty through Queen Victoria and spread through marriage alliances like a slow, polite curse. In Russia, it affected Tsarevich Alexei, the only son of Tsar Nicholas II. Alexei was fragile and constantly ill, where even a minor injury could be life-threatening. His parents lived in fear and secrecy, which helped elevate the influence of Grigory Rasputin, further destabilizing the monarchy. A genetic disorder quietly contributed to the collapse of Imperial Russia, all because royal families kept marrying within the same narrow circles. Inbreeding did not just affect bodies, it affected politics, decisions, and entire empires. This pattern becomes clear again in Portugal, where the House of Aviz and later the House of Braganza practiced cousin marriage to maintain independence from Spain. The strategy was understandable, but the cost was severe. Portuguese kings showed signs of physical weakness, infertility, and early death. King Sebastian of Portugal was young, frail, obsessed with crusading fantasies, and left no heirs. He died in battle in Morocco, triggering a succession crisis that led to Spain temporarily taking control of Portugal anyway. For generations of inbreeding to avoid Spanish rule, Portugal ended up under Spanish rule regardless, which is darkly poetic. In Poland and Lithuania, royal intermarriage with neighboring dynasties produced rulers who were politically influential but physically fragile. The Jagiellonian dynasty married extensively into Habsburg, Bassa, and Warsa.
Bohemian and Hungarian families. Over time, male heirs became rarer. Many died young, fertility declined, and eventually the dynasties simply ran out of viable heirs. There was no explosion or dramatic collapse, just a quiet genetic fade-out. This is also where appearance becomes important, because repeated inbreeding made certain physical traits visible, even without historical footnotes. Prominent jaws, narrow chins, drooping eyelids, and distinctive noses began repeating across generations. Court painters softened these features, adjusted proportions, and presented healthier, sturdier versions of reality. But even with artistic help, the patterns remain visible. This becomes especially obvious in families like the Spanish Bourbons and the Austrian branches of Europe's aristocracy, where the traits stopped being subtle and became defining, and the consequences stopped being theoretical. Royal inbreeding was not reckless, it was methodical, planned and approved by councils, churches, and contracts. That is what makes it so quietly devastating. If your eyes are a little heavy right now, that's perfect. That means we're right in the sweet spot. History is humming along at a comfortable pace. Nobody is shouting, and the royals are still making the same mistakes they've been making for hundreds of years. Last time, we reached the point where inbreeding stopped being a footnote and started becoming visible. Not in a shocking way, more in a quiet, they all kind of look the same sort of way. This is the stage where family traits stop being charming quirks and start turning into dynasty-wide branding. So let's float gently into one of the most strangely recognizable houses in Europe, even if people don't always know its name, the House of Bourbon. Now, the Bourbons ruled France, Spain, and various other territories, and they were technically a different dynasty from the Habsburgs, but genetically, the separation was more of a suggestion than a rule. The Bourbons loved cousin marriages. They married into the Habsburgs. They married back into other Bourbon branches. They married anyone who already had Bourbon blood, because that made inheritance simpler and paperwork shorter. And slowly, something began to happen. Faces began to repeat. If you look at portraits of Bourbon kings across generations, there's a certain look that keeps showing up. Heavy-lidded eyes, long noses, narrow jaws, a kind of sleepy, drooping expression that makes everyone look permanently underwhelmed by existence, which, to be fair, might have been accurate. Let's start with Louis XIII of France. Sickly, anxious, frequently ill, described as emotionally distant and physically weak, he had trouble producing heirs and seemed generally uncomfortable with the whole concept of being alive. His marriage was political, his upbringing was stressful, and his family tree loops back on itself in ways that modern geneticists would not love. His son, Louis XIV, the Sun King, managed to power through with sheer force of personality, but even he wasn't immune. He suffered from chronic health problems, lost most of his children, and relied heavily on mistresses to produce surviving offspring. And by the time we reach later Bourbon generations, the weaknesses start stacking. Now let's slide sideways into Spain, where the Bourbon line took over after the Habsburgs finally collapsed under the weight of their own jawlines. You might expect the Bourbons to bring genetic relief. They did not. The Spanish Bourbons continued marrying close relatives, often with Habsburg ancestry still very much in the mix, and the result was a family that inherited not just a throne, but a long list of health issues. Take King Charles IV of Spain. He was described as slow, indecisive, and physically unimpressive. His wife, Maria Luisa, was the dominant force in the relationship, which wasn't necessarily bad, but it did lead to political chaos. Their children suffered from various ailments, and none inspired much confidence in the future of the monarchy, which is never ideal. Now let's drift into a family that doesn't get talked about enough when discussing inbreeding, but absolutely should: the House of Savoy. The Savoys ruled parts of Italy for centuries and eventually became kings of a unified Italy. They married cousins frequently to maintain control over their territories, and over time, the Savoy rulers developed a reputation for being physically fragile: small stature, poor health, short lifespans. One king after another struggled with illness, leaving regents and advisors to do most of the actual ruling. And while Italy eventually unified under their banner, the dynasty itself never quite shook the feeling that it was held together by paperwork and stubbornness rather than robust health. Now let's slow down and talk about recognition, because this is the phase of royal inbreeding where even contemporaries start noticing.
People in court would whisper about how the king looked just like his uncle, or his grandfather, or his cousin, or all three at once, and not in a flattering way. This is also when marriage negotiations get increasingly awkward, because by now, everyone is related to everyone else. Foreign courts would exchange letters trying to figure out if a potential bride was too closely related to the groom. Genealogies were examined, degrees of separation were counted, and more often than not, someone would shrug and say, well, close enough, because alliances mattered more than chromosomes. Now let's gently bring in the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't a country so much as a deeply confusing legal agreement with crowns. The empire was dominated by a small number of aristocratic families who married each other repeatedly. The Habsburgs were the most famous, yes, but they were supported by a network of equally interrelated houses. The Hohenzollerns, rulers of Prussia, practiced cousin marriage, but were slightly more restrained. Even so, they produced kings like Frederick William I, whose obsessive behavior and violent temper might have had environmental causes, but also fit neatly into a pattern of inherited instability. His son, Frederick the Great, brilliant but emotionally distant, deeply anxious and physically frail, again,
Not a diagnosis, just a pattern. Now, let's gently shift focus from mental and physical traits to something subtler, but equally important, reproduction. Because one of the clearest indicators of inbreeding in royal families was how difficult it became to produce surviving heirs. Queens experienced repeated miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who died within days or weeks. Kings who desperately needed sons found themselves staring at empty cradles and increasingly desperate prayer schedules. And the response was never, maybe we should stop marrying relatives. The response was, try again, which meant more pregnancies, more strain, more heartbreak, all of it documented in polite court language that makes everything sound far less tragic than it actually was. Now, let's pause briefly on dynastic pressure. Royal children weren't just children, they were solutions to problems, insurance policies, living contracts. A prince who died wasn't just a personal loss, he was a political disaster. So when inbreeding reduced fertility and survivability, it didn't just affect families, it destabilized entire regions. Wars were fought because someone didn't produce an heir. Alliances collapsed because a line ended. Countries were absorbed because a family ran out of viable children, all because everyone insisted on keeping marriages in-house. Now, as we drift toward the end of this part, we're approaching the dynasties where inbreeding stops being an undercurrent and becomes the main story, where traits don't just repeat, they dominate, where health problems don't just complicate rule, they define it. In Part 4, we'll finally step into the royal houses where inbreeding reaches its most refined, most documented, and most quietly tragic form, the families where the bloodline didn't just narrow, it collapsed inward. By now, we've reached the point in the story where royal inbreeding is no longer subtle, no longer debatable, and no longer something historians need to gently imply with polite language. This is the phase where even the people living at the time could tell something was deeply off, but still chose to continue because stopping would have meant admitting the entire system was flawed, and monarchies are very bad at admitting that. So now, finally, we arrive at the dynasties where inbreeding didn't just weaken the line, it ended it. We have to start, inevitably, with the most famous example, not because they were the first, but because they were the most committed, the Spanish Habsburgs. The Spanish Habsburgs didn't invent royal inbreeding, they perfected it. Over nearly 2 centuries, they married cousins, double cousins, uncles to nieces, and repeatedly folded the same bloodlines back into themselves. These were strategic decisions meant to keep Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, and much of Europe under one family's control, and for a while it worked. Spain became vast, wealthy, and powerful. But biologically, the system was quietly collapsing.
Philip II of Spain serves as a midpoint example. Deeply religious, emotionally distant, chronically ill, married 4 times, mostly within his own extended family, losing multiple children in infancy, while the survivors were often sickly. His son, Don Carlos, was physically deformed, mentally unstable, violent, and plagued by hallucinations and impulsive cruelty, eventually locked away by his own father and dying alone at 23. At the time, people blamed sin or divine punishment, but modern analysis shows his parents were first cousins, whose own parents were also closely related, leaving his genetic inheritance with nowhere left to go. And yet the dynasty continued, generation after generation, believing their bloodline was sacred and outsiders would dilute its power, leading ultimately to Charles II of Spain. Charles was the product of inbreeding so extreme that his family tree was more knot than branch. Parents who were uncle and niece, grandparents who were cousins, ancestors repeating again and again. He was frail, struggled to chew and speak, walked late, fell ill often, was mentally impaired, dependent on advisors, and infertile despite 2 marriages. With Charles II, the Spanish Habsburg line ended not in revolution or execution, but in a quiet biological stop, triggering a massive succession crisis and wars across Europe, all because a family refused to marry anyone new. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere. In the Kingdom of Naples, rulers were deeply unwell and incapable of sustained rule. In small German principalities, cousin marriages produced rulers with chronic illness, developmental delays, epilepsy, and infertility, leading dynasties to simply run out of heirs and be absorbed without drama. Britain avoided the worst extremes but still paid a price, as Queen Victoria's descendants spread inherited conditions like hemophilia across Europe, turning royal bloodlines into political liabilities. The Russian Romanovs collapsed, the Spanish Bourbons weakened, German monarchies fell after World War I, and while war and politics mattered, biology had already set the stage because weak rulers invite strong challenges. Royal families believed blood was destiny, legitimacy came from ancestry, and power lived in genes, not governance. So when rulers were sickly, they blamed individuals instead of the system itself, because admitting a structural flaw would mean admitting monarchy was fragile. By the 19th and 20th centuries, dynastic marriage collapsed not due to genetic awareness, but because monarchy itself lost power. Modern royals still marry within elite circles, but the stakes are lower and the empires are gone. Inbreeding didn't destroy monarchy overnight or cause a single dramatic downfall. It worked slowly, politely, administratively, weakening families until they could no longer support the weight of power they inherited. It's easy to mock these rulers, but they weren't stupid. They were trapped by tradition, expectations, and a system that valued blood purity over survival, and generation after generation paid the price, not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly.
We're talking about gladiators. Not the movie kind, not the shredded, oil-soaked action figures screaming about freedom, but the real ones, the historically accurate ones, the ones who were surprisingly soft around the edges, slightly overweight, mildly grumpy, and for the most part living on a diet that would make a modern fitness influencer quietly pass away. This is the story of the Horderi, the barley men. And yes, they were mostly vegan. Of course they were. It all begins, as deeply disappointing historical truths often do, in ancient Rome, a civilization that loved spectacle and violence, but loved routine even more. Gladiators were not wild warriors roaming free, they were expensive investments, and Rome did not like its investments dying unnecessarily. They were fed carefully, trained methodically, and managed with all the warmth and empathy of a very organized livestock operation. Most gladiators were enslaved men, criminals, prisoners of war, and a few volunteers whose personal choices historians still quietly judge. But once inside a gladiator school, a ludus, life became brutally structured. Wake up, train, eat, rest, train again, eat again, sleep, repeat. Like a very violent gym membership you couldn't cancel. And the food was not heroic feasts of dripping meat, but barley, beans, lentils, grains, and vegetables. Lots of vegetables. Meat wasn't forbidden, just impractical, expensive, unpredictable, and not useful for building the kind of body Roman trainers wanted, because gladiators were not meant to look like Greek statues, they were meant to look padded. Roman doctors believed body fat protected organs and reduced lethal wounds, so gladiators were intentionally fed carb-heavy diets to stay soft but not obese, cushioned essentially. Ancient Rome inventing bulking without Instagram. Contemporary writers described them as round, solid, thick, not ripped, just very hard to kill quickly. And their bones confirm it, with plant-heavy diet markers showing athletes fueled by beans. This earned them the nickname horderi, barley men, a name that sounds less intimidating than it should, but reveals the truth. Gladiators were managed performers engineered for endurance, not beauty. The crowd didn't want efficiency, it wanted long, exhausting fights that dragged on until everyone was tired, including the audience. So gladiators trained relentlessly in strict, repetitive routines with heavier weapons to make real fights feel lighter. They also received high-quality medical care because, again, investment. Doctors like Galen treated their fractures, muscle tears, and joint damage, stitching them up, resting them, feeding them recovery meals, and sending them back when profitable, making gladiators in some ways healthier than the average Roman laborer, despite the eventual violent death that came with a very flexible Roman definition of workplace hazards. Socially, gladiators were legally disgraced infamies, yet wildly adored, with graffiti love notes, marriage proposals, elite women obsessing over them, merchandise sold in the form of scraped sweat mixed into cosmetics, and a strange contradiction where controlled men were celebrated like celebrities. Their diet was deliberate, even including a charred plant ash drink for calcium and bone strength, ancient sports nutrition that worked, producing dense, well-heeled skeletons that show these men were meant to last. Some fought for decades, became reliable performers, even comfortable in their grim routine, and a few earned freedom symbolized by a wooden sword, though not all took it. Outside the ludus, steady food and medical care weren't guaranteed, and structure, fame, and barley were hard to give up. In the end, gladiators were not wild symbols of masculine excess, but regulated, carb-loaded, slightly chubby professionals optimized for entertainment, an image later exaggerated by art and myth, hiding the reality of men eating beans, training on schedules, seeing doctors, and trying to survive one more performance. They were athletes, fighters, and carefully fed barley men with managed body fat and bone supplements. And honestly, that makes them more interesting, because history is always stranger when you stop letting it show off and simply let the sand settle and the arena empty out. Let's gently ease back into ancient Rome, where the sand is always warm, the rules are very strict, and everyone involved is pretending this is about honor instead of profit. Last time, we talked about the barley, the beans, the gentle padding, and the fact that gladiators were basically ancient endurance athletes with a high-carb meal plan and a surprisingly good healthcare package. Now let's talk about what their lives were actually like, because once you strip away the cinematic yelling and slow-motion sword swings, what you're left with is something far more Roman: schedules, contracts, branding, and a deeply controlled form of celebrity. A gladiator's day began early, not because they were eager, but because Rome loved routine. Training sessions were long but repetitive, not creative or expressive, just drills again and again, step, swing, block, reset, over and over.
They trained with wooden weapons heavier than the real ones, not as cruelty, but conditioning, so that by the time they held an actual sword or trident, it felt lighter and more manageable. Training wasn't about improvisation either. Gladiators weren't encouraged to invent new moves or surprise anyone. They were taught specific fighting styles called armatura: the murmillo, the thrakes, the retiarius with the net, who everyone judged quietly, each role locked into prescribed armor, weapons, and tactics. It was less free combat and more professional wrestling with real injuries, which is why matches were often partially choreographed, not fully scripted, but structured, with rhythms, expected exchanges, and moments designed to look impressive without being immediately lethal, because investment mattered. During all of this, gladiators lived together, ate together, slept in shared quarters, formed ons, rivalries, and quiet friendships no one wrote poetry about because it wasn't romantic enough. They were co-workers and sometimes roommates. Discipline was strict because Rome did not do gentle encouragement, and punishments existed: whippings, confinement, reduced rations, but excessive punishment wasn't encouraged, since an injured gladiator was a financial loss. Control was psychological as much as physical, built on promises of advancement, better matches, public recognition, and maybe freedom one day. This brings us to something oddly modern: branding. Gladiators had stage names, dramatic animal names, or mythological references that sounded intimidating, even if the man himself was quietly chewing barley and thinking about his knees. These names were painted on walls, written on pottery, scribbled in graffiti, and some gladiators became local celebrities whose faces were recognizable and whose fight records were discussed like sports stats: 3 wins, 1 loss, 2 draws, survived 5 matches, known for endurance, not for beauty or elegance, but for not dying quickly. The fame was strange because officially gladiators were infames, legally stained, unable to hold office or testify normally. Yet socially, they were everywhere. Women wore jewelry with gladiator motifs, children scratched their names into walls, senators attended games obsessively because Rome loved contradictions and needed them. Then there was romantic attention, something Roman writers complained about endlessly, usually men deeply upset that elite women were attracted to gladiators, muscular, famous men who existed outside respectable society and were therefore dangerous in the most boring way possible. Women sent gifts, letters, tokens, even arranged meetings, which from Rome's perspective was deeply inappropriate, and from a human perspective made perfect sense, because gladiators were visible, emotional, performative, sweating publicly and showing fear, pain, and resilience, while elite husbands discussed grain supply and quietly died of gout. Gladiators had fans, and Rome monetized that too. Gladiator sweat collected with a strigil after training was mixed into creams and sold as cosmetic, because if someone famous sweats, it apparently becomes skincare, a concept with no modern parallel that feels dignified, and yet it sold. Fame did not mean freedom. Gladiators couldn't leave the ludus without permission, couldn't choose their fights, couldn't refuse training, and even successful ones were owned, managed, traded between schools like very muscular paperwork. Freedom, when it came, was ceremonial, symbolized by the rudis, a wooden sword that was symbolic, gentle, and anticlimactic. And even then, many didn't leave, because outside the ludus, life was uncertain, with no guaranteed meals, doctors, or audience cheering when you did your job correctly. Some retired gladiators became trainers, some bodyguards, some tavern owners whose stories slowly became exaggerated, and some returned to the arena voluntarily, which tells you everything about how deeply institutionalized this life was. Gladiators did die, despite precautions and doctors, but death rates were lower than people assume, with many matches ending in surrender as a defeated gladiator raised a finger asking for mercy, while the crowd reacted and the sponsor decided. Thumbs involved, but not the way movies suggest, and often mercy was granted because killing a trained performer wasn't efficient. Rome was brutal but practical, preferring prolonged exploitation to short-term spectacle. So death usually came from cumulative damage, infection, or injuries that didn't heal correctly, slow, boring, uncinematic, fitting the theme perfectly. As the empire aged, the games became more elaborate and more hollow. Costs rose, public appetite shifted, Christianity introduced a different discomfort with public violence, and eventually the games faded away not suddenly or dramatically, but gradually, with less funding and less enthusiasm, until the barley men drifted out of history. What replaced them was a myth, the shredded warrior, the noble slave, the speech about freedom that never actually happened, which is why it's nice to return to the truth sometimes, a truth that is quieter, softer, full of lentils. Gladiators were not symbols of raw masculinity. They were managed bodies, carefully fed, trained, and repaired, strong and skilled and often brave, but also tired, regulated, slightly padded, very human. And that's where we gently rest. The barley men were quietly exiting the arena, not with a dramatic final bow or a speech, but by slowly fading away as Rome changed its mind about what it wanted to pay for. And that was where the misunderstanding began. Once gladiators were gone, they became useful symbols, and when historical figures become useful, accuracy tends to leave the room very politely. Later Romans romanticized them, medieval writers misunderstood them, Renaissance artists redesigned them, and modern movies turned them into protein-powered philosophy majors.
Somewhere along the way, the soft, bean-fed professional athlete was replaced by a myth, a very loud myth. That myth insists gladiators were lean, sculpted, permanently angry, and fueled by meat. It claims they represented raw masculinity, freedom, and rebellion. The evidence, however, suggests they represented accounting, and those two things do not get along. Ancient sources never described gladiators as impossibly shredded. They described them as strong, solid, thick, durable, and built to absorb punishment, which is not what modern culture likes to glorify. We prefer visible effort, sharp lines, muscles that look uncomfortable, and bodies that seem to exist purely for aesthetics. Rome did not care about aesthetics. Rome cared about outcomes. The outcome it wanted was a long fight that did not end in immediate death. So the gladiator body was optimized accordingly. There's a quiet irony in modern fitness culture, because if you strip away the branding, supplements, and motivational yelling, much of modern athletic training accidentally mirrors ancient gladiator logic. High carbohydrate diets for endurance, controlled fat percentages for protection and energy reserves, periodized training, a focus on recovery and injury prevention, all sounds strangely familiar. Even the idea that athletes should not be lean year-round is thoroughly Roman. Gladiators did not walk around in permanent fight-ready condition. They trained, rested, and ate to recover. They did not diet for appearances, but for survival, which makes the modern obsession with looking like a gladiator deeply funny, because it usually means doing the opposite of what gladiators actually did: less food, more cutting, more stress, and less recovery. The barley men would have looked at modern gym culture with confusion and mild concern. When Christianity gained influence, the narrative shifted again. Early Christian writers condemned gladiatorial games as immoral, violent, and degrading, which was fair. But in doing so, they also stripped gladiators of their humanity. Gladiators became symbols of pagan cruelty rather than people with routines, diets, and bad knees. During the Renaissance, artists revived classical imagery,
emphasizing idealized bodies with exaggerated muscularity. This was not historical reconstruction, but wish fulfillment. Artists were not interested in barley, they were interested in marble. And gladiators became visually indistinguishable from gods, with perfect proportions, eternal tension, and no visible body fat. That tells us far more about Renaissance aesthetics than Roman reality. Modern cinema continued the transformation. Films needed heroes, clear emotional arcs, and muscles that read well on screen. So gladiators became ripped rebels fighting for freedom, individuality, and vaguely modern ideas of self-actualization. It is entertaining, but it is not true. Real gladiators did not fight for abstract freedom. They fought because they were told to or because it was the most stable option available. They did not give speeches, but followed routines. They did not train alone in dramatic isolation, but in groups, under supervision, on schedules. They were not anti-system, they were the system. Gladiators were also not constantly angry. They were tired, sore, cautious, and aware that recklessness shortened careers. Survivors learned control, pacing, and awareness. This was not rage, but professionalism. Their diet reflected the same practicality. It was not accidental, but studied, managed, and adjusted. Barley was cheap, reliable, high in carbohydrates, and easy to store and prepare. Beans and lentils provided protein, vegetables added nutrients, and meat appeared occasionally without dominating the diet. This was not poverty food, but strategic food, effective enough that Roman doctors wrote about it approvingly. Even the ash drink, made from burned plants, functioned as a mineral supplement to strengthen bones and aid healing. It sounds unpleasant, but so do most effective things. Modern athletes take calcium supplements. Gladiators drank ash water, following the same logic with different vibes. For many gladiators, life in the ludus was more stable than life outside it. They had regular meals, shelter, medical care, and clear expectations, which mattered in a world without social safety nets. That's why the idea of gladiators as purely tragic victims doesn't quite fit. Some were brutalized and suffered horribly, but others found structure, purpose, and even a strange kind of security. History is rarely clean. Gladiators were also not unique in this respect, because Rome managed bodies everywhere. Soldiers had regulated diets, slaves had calculated rations, and athletes trained under strict regimens. Rome understood logistics, calories, and efficiency, and it did not romanticize struggle, but optimized it. That mindset explains why gladiators survived longer than expected, why their bones show healing, and why their lives, while constrained, were not constant chaos. When modern culture imagines gladiators as symbols of unrestrained violence, it projects its own fantasies onto a very organized past. The truth is quieter and more procedural, which makes it perfect bedtime history. Nothing puts you to sleep than realizing that even ancient violence ran on spreadsheets. Gladiators are remembered for their deaths, but their lives were mostly spent eating, training, resting, and waiting. Waiting for the next match, for injuries to heal, for approval, and sometimes for freedom. Long stretches of routine were punctuated by brief moments of danger, which is surprisingly relatable. The barley men were not failed warriors, secret vegans, or historical embarrassments. They were people shaped by a system that valued spectacle but demanded efficiency. People whose bodies were carefully maintained tools, and people who lived far slower lives than their reputation suggests.
So let's slow everything down just a little more. Let the arena empty completely. Let the crowd go home. Let the sand be raked smooth. No cheering, no shouting. Just the faint sense that something very loud used to happen here, and now it doesn't. Because this is usually how history actually ends. Not with a bang, just with disinterest. By the late Roman Empire, gladiators were no longer the cultural obsession they once were. They still existed, technically. Games were still held, but the passion had thinned out. The money wasn't flowing the same way, and the novelty was gone. Rome had new problems, bigger ones, less theatrical ones. Inflation, political instability, border pressure, emperors who didn't last long enough to learn anyone's name, and in times like that, maintaining a massive entertainment industry built around carefully fed, medically supervised, slightly overweight fighters started to feel optional. Christianity didn't immediately end gladiatorial games, despite what popular history likes to suggest. It criticized them, discouraged them, slowly made them socially awkward, which is honestly how most cultural practices actually die. Not outlawed overnight, but quietly judged until participation becomes embarrassing. Sponsors stopped paying, crowds shrank, fewer schools trained gladiators, the infrastructure decayed, and eventually the barley men simply weren't worth the effort anymore. There was no grand farewell, no final tournament remembered for centuries, just a system that stopped being useful. The men who survived it drifted into other roles: trainers, guards, laborers, anonymous citizens with unusual scars and very strong legs. While their bodies aged, their routines ended, their carefully managed diets became less careful, and then they disappeared into the general population where history tends to lose interest. What survived was the idea, the gladiator as symbol, endlessly reshaped by later generations into strength without context, violence without logistics, muscles without barley, because we remember the blade and forget the lentils, and that pattern shows up everywhere in history. We remember kings as powerful and forget their gout, remember queens as elegant and forget their constant pregnancies and anxiety, remember empires as grand and forget the accounting. Gladiators are just one of the clearest examples of this selective memory, because when you strip away the myth, what you're left with is something oddly modern: workers whose bodies were managed by institutions, public figures with restricted rights, celebrities who were legally marginalized, athletes optimized not for health or happiness, but for performance and profit. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because the past isn't as alien as we like to pretend. It's just less filtered. The barley men weren't jokes or failures or secretly doing something wrong. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to do: eating what they were given, training how they were told, performing when scheduled, resting when allowed, surviving longer than expected because the system wanted them to, and when the system no longer cared, they faded away. Which is one of the most Roman endings imaginable. So if there's something gentle to take from this before sleep, it's this: history isn't made of constant intensity. It's made of routines, of meals eaten every day, of training repeated endlessly, of bodies adapting quietly to expectations placed on them. The loud moments get remembered, the quiet ones do the real work. The gladiator's life was mostly quiet, and that's why it's so easy to misunderstand. So tonight, as you let your thoughts slow down, maybe picture a gladiator not in the arena, but afterward, sitting on a bench, breathing heavily, eating barley porridge, listening to the sounds of the city settling for the night. No speeches, no destiny, just another day completed. And that's where we'll leave them. Thank you for drifting through this strange, carb-heavy corner of history with me. If your mind wandered, that's perfect. If you fell asleep somewhere around the ash drink, even better, because history will still be here tomorrow. It's very patient. And for now, you don't need to remember anything or imagine anything dramatic. Just let the noise fade, let the lights dim, let the barley men rest. Good night.